15. Alliance with the Red Army. Makhno and the staff of the insurgents allied themselves with the Red Army, for one thing, because they placed the revolution's interests above ideological differences, and, for another, because they were beset by a terrible shortage of arms and munitions, trophies taken from the enemy being insufficient to make up for the daily consumption of cartridges and insufficient to arm the many volunteers who showed up to fight in their ranks. As far as the Makhnovists were concerned, this was only a military and by no stretch of the imagination a political compact, for in political terms Bolsheviks were still, in their eyes, adversaries, as the Second Regional Congress had confirmed. Moscow took a different view. From the moment that a military alliance exists, there is automatically political dependency, i.e., formal recognition of the authority of the Ukrainian Soviet government. These two very divergent outlooks were to lie at the root of a latent conflict. For the time being, the Bolsheviks had scarcely any option, they had scarcely any troops in Ukraine and the danger of white offensives was looming. Indeed, at the beginning of 1919 the Red Army in Ukraine was made up almost exclusively of detachments of local partisans which had subordinated themselves for the very same reason as the Makhnovists. Such composition was not at all to the taste of the Red leadership who were preoccupied with hierarchical order and discipline. To begin with, their efforts were going to be devoted to overhauling the structure of the partisan groups and turning these into regiments, brigades, and divisions. This is how Vitaly Primakov, one of the chief Bolshevik military officials of the times, described this phase. Towards the end of January 1919, substantial reforms were introduced in the Red insurgent army. Divisions were organized on the Russian model, the quality of headquarters staff was noticeably improved. Certain regimental commanders were stood down for acts of banditry. The regiments were overseen by political commissars, political sections were introduced in the divisions. Some independent regimental commanders were removed or shot. The tide of regimental ataman was abolished and that of commander replaced it. The finest regiments were turned into brigades. Some artillery divisions were set up. Based on the Dnieper, the army proceeded all that February with this reshuffle. Then it entered into contact with the atamans Grigorev, Mahkno, and others. The government was now confronted with the task of preserving its army from contagion by the Makhnovskina and the Grigorievskina. This burden fell entirely upon the army's youthful political cadres, which simultaneously conducted a political agitation campaign and chika work, not only educating the troops but also shooting the most inflexible atamans. This tiresome duty was performed with honor by the young political cadres. Thus the Bolsheviks' primary concern was to conduct a squalid police operation designed to turn free insurgents, revolutionary insurgents, into a slavish, obedient mass and to shoot honest revolutionaries if need be, whose only failing was their refusal to kowtow to the evangel of the Leninist state. What Primakov, who apparently played a leading part in this whole process, leaves unsaid is that during all this time the atamans, from whom he feared contagion, held the front heroically against the White Guards. According to the military agreement concluded, Bolshevik political commissars were to operate within the Makhnovist insurgent army ranks. This army was pompously rechristened Brigade. Also the Cheka wanted to screen its members over. Both the commissars and the Cheka were chased out by the peasants or treated with contempt by the insurgents who were fighting for their land, their families and their freedom, and who were well aware that these would be best guaranteed only through the success of the social revolution, and who had no political lessons to learn from missionaries of the self-styled scientific socialist faith. Makhno himself obliged to put up with them, treated them with sarcasm, Bolshevik missionaries complained. Moreover, the military compact was none too scrupulously observed by the Bolsheviks. Aside from an initial delivery of 100,000 cartridges and 3,000 Italian special caliber rifles, each one accompanied by only a dozen shells, that was all the Makhnovists were to get, and none of the promised cannon or machine guns. Anyway, in some instances the cartridges were faulty, having been sabotaged by Denikin supporters who had infiltrated the ranks of the Red Army. Some of them were later to be discovered and shot. This piecemeal delivery was deliberate, for the reasons set out by Primakov earlier, and for some bizarre reason applied also to deliveries to Dybenko, who, although a dyed-in-the-wool Bolshevik, was nonetheless suspected of playing along with the atamans. in his forces, every 2 fighters were entitled to a rifle between them, whereas among Grigorev, the ratio was 1 between 3, with the worst ratio the one among 4 that prevailed among the Makhnovists. The Bolsheviks also bemoaned the growing influence of anarchists over the insurgent movement, and more so, the presence of a rather sizable group of left SRs, who had been accepted by the insurgents only on the basis of the fight against the whites and for the power of the Free Soviets. Especially since these left SRs included Viktor Popov, a Black Sea sailor who had led the left SR rising against Lenin in July 1918 and had come within an ace of success. He was subsequently to play a very active role in the Makhnovist movement, taking charge among other things of its intelligence branch. Mahkno was not content to quarantine the political commissars. He also arrested a detachment of Chekists who were beginning operations in Budyensk and had them manhandled into the front lines. It was hardly surprising in these circumstances that relations became strained and that the Red authorities were forever on the lookout for quibbles, inventing tales of uprisings where all that was going on was simple troop movements and units relieving one another. Joseph Dybet's evidence is very revealing of these frictions and of the Bolsheviks' bad faith. To make matters worse, Dybets was a former anarcho-syndicalist of some note, having been one of the founders of Golos Truda, the Voice of Labor, the great Russian anarcho-syndicalist organ published in the US, where he had spent 10 years an immigrant. According to Dybets, the fog shrouding his thinking had lifted after he read Lenin's The State and Revolution, whereupon he had ardently embraced this new Pope's religion of realism and efficiency. In February 1919, he was in Budyensk. The Makhnovists occupied the port and Dybets met Makhno, which gave rise to the following laconic exchange. "Good day, Dybets. So, it seems you're a renegade now?" "Good day. It would appear that I am a renegade." "Which means you are completely Bolshevik?" "Yes, completely." "Yes, it's true that many have sold out to the Bolsheviks." "Nothing to be done about it." "That's right, they do sell out. I too have sold out." "Take care, lest you regret it." "I will take care." Dybet's wife, Rosa, had remained an anarchist and, what is more, had been an inmate in the same prison in Ekaterinoslav as Makhno 10 years before. This was a significant point in Dybets's favor and afforded him a certain license in the tone of his conversation with Makhno. This is how their exchange went, as Dybets tells it at any rate. Dybets to Makhno, "What is your program?" "To eliminate the whites first and then the Bolsheviks." "Well, what do you intend to do after that?" "Afterwards, the people will govern themselves." "And how will they be able to govern themselves?" "Let me have your views on that." Makhno spelled out, in vague fashion, the anarchist thinking about the absence of constraints upon peasant communes which would not be subordinated to the state, nor to any organizational center. "Our activists," he said, "are confined solely to agitation and propaganda. The people themselves do everything. That is what we are doing also at the moment in military affairs. The army runs itself." That's absurd, utterly absurd. But Makhno was not to be put off. "You will see. First we are going to rid ourselves of the whites and then of the Bolsheviks." Dybets tackled Makhno yet again, asking him what he intended to establish as a regime. The Ukrainian libertarian's answer was, "The People's Commune. The Anarchist Republic," which was hardly surprising. Dybets reckoned that he had found a crushing argument, when he countered that Makhno couldn't even run a factory and was surrounded only by bandits and anarchists on the run from the bullets of the Cheka. A contemptuous Makhno brought the exchange to a dose by dismissing him several times as a renegade. Belated and sudden though his conversion may have been, Dybets played a significant role among local Bolsheviks. He headed a revolutionary committee in Budyensk, a committee representing nobody but the Bolsheviks but which nonetheless arrogated certain rights to itself. Dybets thus crowed about having put one over on the Makhnovists, at a time when, according to the testimony of Antonov Ovsenko, half of the Makhnovists were virtually barefoot, and when the Gulyai military revolutionary Soviet urgently requested a shipment of 12 wagon loads of leather, produced by the tanneries of Budyensk, Dybets arranged to have the shipment rerouted to Moscow, then indignantly accused the Makhnovists of having been behind its disappearance. He smugly recalled that in so doing he had furnished himself with a decisive comment for his discussions with the Makhnovists. At the first sign of a problem, he used to say to them, "And the leather, what have you done with it?" Mahkno authorized the display of Bolshevik newspapers in Guliai-Poli, Berdyansk and Mariupol. A certain Uralov, a Leninist militant, tells this tale. Bearing a safe conduct pass from Makhno, he set out for Berdyansk, there to see to publication of a newspaper for his party. Right from the very first two issues, he railed violently against the Makhnovist insurgents while they at the time were busy containing a push by the enemy. Protests having had no effect, some insurgents turned up to smash the plates of the third issue of Uralov's provocative publication. For their part, the insurgents kept up their side of the bargain. They sent two of their tried and tested regiments to help Dybenko combat the White Guard and German settler detachments in the Crimea. For their own part, they went on the offensive in April and got within a few kilometers of Taganrog, the headquarters of Denikin's front. For want of arms and ammunition, they were unable to capitalize upon this success. Chance brought them into Mariupol with some Frenchmen who were unloading materials and arms for the Denikinists. The Frenchmen suggested to the insurgents that they swap the weapons for some coal stacked on the dockside and which they needed urgently, but the Frenchmen met with a categorical refusal and the whole episode ended with some artillery exchanges. The Kremlin's official mouthpiece, Pravda, acknowledged the merits of Makhno and wrote of him on April 3, 1919. The Ukrainians say of Makhno, "Our Batko fears neither God nor devil, yet he is a simple man like us." There followed a biographical sketch of Nestor. The peasants, despite the threat of their being shot for having protected Makhno, help him in all things. He has set up a detachment and turned down a proposal of union with the Directory, declaring to a villagers' congress in Alexandrovsk that the Petlierist movement is only an adventure distracting the masses from the revolution. With 600 men, he took Ekaterinoslav, investing the city via the railway station, but was forced to pull back to the Dnieper. Being under Dybenko's command, he has been incorporated into the Red Army, of which he forms a brigade. He has been assigned the task of fighting the White Volunteers and of keeping the railroad clear up as far as Berdyansk, in which he has acquitted himself brilliantly. The Whites' finest regiments have been smashed. Things livened up, nonetheless, when the Military Revolutionary Soviet appointed by the Second Congress of Peasants and Insurgents summoned the Third Regional Congress for April 10 in Guliai-Poli. Delegates from 72 districts, representing upwards of 2 million inhabitants, took part. All civil and military issues were dealt with great gusto. Towards the end of the proceedings, the Congress received a telegram from Dybenko in which the latter pronounced the Congress counter-revolutionary and outlawed its organizers, whom he threatened with the most rigorous repressive measures. Addressing himself to Makhno, Dybenko ordered him to ensure that there was no repetition of the episode. A copy of the telegram was forwarded to the Guliai-Poli Soviet. The Military Revolutionary Soviet was superciliously ignored. In its reply, which has become famous, the latter made it its business to enlighten Dybenko as to the situation. Quote, "Before pronouncing the Congress counter-revolutionary, Comrade Dybenko did not take the trouble to establish in whose name and for what purpose it had been summoned, right? So allow us, Your Excellency, to inform you by whom and for what this, according to you, patently counter-revolutionary, Congress has been summoned, and then, maybe, it will not strike you as quite so frightening as you describe it. The Congress, as stated above, was summoned by the Executive Committee of the Military Revolutionary Soviet of the Guliai-Poli, that being the central township. It has described itself as the Third Regional Congress. It was convened in order to lay down the future policy line for activities of the Military Revolutionary Soviet. You see, Comrade Dybenko, there had already been 2 previous counter-revolutionary congresses of this sort. Now to the question that you might pose yourself: whence comes the Military Revolutionary Soviet and to what end was it established? If you are not au fait, Comrade Dybenko, then allow us to bring you up to date. This Soviet was established in accordance with the resolution of the Second Congress, which took place on February 12 in Guliai-Poli. You see how long ago that was, for you were not even around then. in order to organize the front and proceed to a volunteer mobilization, given that we were ringed by whites and that the first detachments of insurgent volunteers were insufficient to hold such an extensive front. So there were no Soviet troops in our region, and anyway the populace did not expect much assistance, being of the mind that it was their duty to look to their own defense." End quote. The authors of this reply then set out how and why the Military Revolutionary Soviet, with its 32 members, one delegate from each district of the provinces of Ekaterinostlav and Tavrida, had come into being. Then they harked back to the origins of the convening of the Second Congress, which had been summoned by a 5-member commission appointed by the First Congress on January 23, and who had not been outlawed, in that the sort of hero who would venture to trespass against the people's rights won in open battle at the cost of their own blood, still was not around at that time. Then they went on to explain to Dybenko, whom they held was ignorant of all this, the basic reasons behind the insurgent movement and the progress of its fight against its enemies first of all, only to return to the appointment of the impugned Soviet, which had only executive powers, and to the sovereign role of the Third Congress apropos evaluation of and formulation of policy on the events in progress. In conclusion, Comrade Dybenko was taken seriously to task. Quote, "There now, Comrade Dybenko, you have before you a picture that should be an eye-opener for you. Collect your wits. Reconsider. Have you the right, you alone, to label as counter-revolutionaries upwards of 1 million workers who have, with their horny hands, cast off the shackles of slavery and henceforth look to themselves for the reshaping of their lives as they see fit? No. If you be a genuine revolutionary, you must help them in their struggle against the oppressors and in the building of a new and free life. Can it be that laws laid down by a handful of individuals, describing themselves as revolutionaries, can afford them the right to declare outside of the law an entire people more revolutionary than themselves? The Soviet's executive committee embodies the whole mass of the people. Is it tolerable or reasonable that laws of violence be thrust upon the lives of a people which has just rid itself of all lawmakers and all laws? Is there some law, according to which a revolutionary is alleged to have the right to enforce the harshest punishment against the revolutionary mass on whose behalf he fights, and this because that same mass has secured for itself the benefits that the revolutionary promised them, freedom and equality? Can that mass remain silent when the revolutionary strips it of the freedom which it has just won? Does the law of revolution require the shooting of a delegate on the grounds that he is striving to achieve in life the task entrusted to him by the revolution mass which appointed him? What interests should the revolutionary defend? Those of the party? Or those of the people at the cost of whose blood the revolution has been set in motion?" End quote. This mini-anthology on the revolutionary autonomy of the workers closed with an invitation, should Dybenko and those like him persist in their dirty businesses, to declare counter-revolutionary and outlaws all who had participated in the foregoing congresses and the combatants who had fought and were fighting still for the people's emancipation without seeking anybody's leave to do so. The signatories to the document, members of the Soviet, finally stated that they would carry on with their tasks and had neither the right nor the duty to default upon the responsibility which the people had delegated onto their shoulders. This text was countersigned by the chairman of the Military Revolutionary Soviet, Chernoniznik, by the vice-chairman, Leonid Kogan, by the secretary, Karbit, and by the members Koval, Petrenko, Dotsenko and others. Makhno was not among them, not having even attended this Congress, having been caught up in fighting, and in any case, he had nothing to do with the supreme organ of the movement. Thus Dybenko discovered with whom he had to deal, the mass of the people. He himself came from the mass of the people and had quite good revolutionary credentials. All he needed was the requisite finesse to distinguish between the language of revolution and that of a party which had proclaimed itself repository of the revolutionary mass's historical and political interests. In fact, he was a bumpkin who did not shrink from the most brutal and disgusting measures if they enforced respect. Dybets describes how he slew the commander of a Red Army cavalry regiment where he stood, without a word spoken, just to ensure readier obedience from the combatants. Although these were commonplace measures, albeit generally used with greater discretion in that army, Dybenko displayed great enthusiasm for them. With Antonov Ovsenko we have a completely different kettle of fish. He was an old Bolshevik militant, one of those professional revolutionaries who had kept the party afloat for years. In October 1917, he had led the Petrograd Military Soviet, which organized the storming of the Winter Palace. At this time he was in command of the Ukrainian front. He was very well aware that the Makhnovist insurgents were supporters of local Soviets, regarded as free Soviets answerable to no central authority. He had wanted to get a more exact notion of the whole commotion denounced by his party colleagues, and so he paid a visit to Gulyai on April 28 and has left us with a superb, objective account of the situation. For a start, he addressed a message to Makhno announcing that he would be passing through the region. By return he received a telegram from Makhno: "I know you to be an upright and independent revolutionary. On behalf of the revolutionary insurgent units of the 3rd Dnieper Brigade and all of the revolutionary organizations of the Gulyai region which proudly bear the banner of the insurrection, I am charged to invite you to call upon us to visit our own little Petrograd Free, Revolutionary Gulyai. En route, Antonov reviewed all recent developments on the front, the fine conduct of the Makhnovists and the advice of one Bolshevik leader, Sokolov, and of Hittis, commander of the Southern Front, to the effect that Makhno be removed from command of his brigade, which struck him as uncalled for since, as the saying goes, one does not change horses in midstream. From the railway station, a troika brought him briskly to Gulyai. He was welcomed to the strains of the International, played by an orchestra. So let us now turn to his account, quote, "A group of bronzed partisans stepped forward to greet the front commander. One man broke ranks, a man of small stature and quite youthful, with somber eyes and a high parka perched on his head. He stopped 2 paces away and saluted, 'Brigade Commander Makhno. We are successful in holding the front. At present we are waging the battle for Mariupol. On behalf of the revolutionary insurgents of the Ekaterinoslav province, I salute the leader of Ukraine's Soviet troops.' Handshake. Makhno introduces the members of the Gulyai Soviet's executive committee and of his staff. Also there is the political commissar of the bridge, my old acquaintance, Marysia Nikiforova. We review the troops. The brigade's main units are on the front. Here there are only a reserve regiment undergoing training and 2 cavalry platoons. Dressed in a motley assortment of uniforms and clothing and brandishing all sorts of arms, the impression they give is nonetheless one full of verve and pugnacious. They devour me with their eyes. In silence they all listen to the front commander's speech about the import of our struggle, on the position on the different fronts, on the heavy responsibility entrusted to the Makhno brigade, on the necessity for iron discipline, and they greeted his concluded words with hurrahs. Makhno replied to the front commander by wishing him welcome, alluded somewhat touchily to the unfair charges laid against the insurgents, mentioned their successes and promised further successes, if support in arms and equipment is forthcoming. His voice is not very loud, there is a slight hiss to it, and his pronunciation is soft. All in all, he does not give the impression of being a great orator, but how attentively they all hear him out. We step into the building housing the brigade staff and quickly inspect its branches. The inspection is gratifying. One can discern the hand of a specialist, Staff Commander Ozarov, at work." End quote. An exchange upon the situation of the front ensued. The deployment of the brigade's units was reviewed, the results of the April 23 offensive examined. While the conversation was in progress, news arrived of the capture of Mariupol and of the capture of every last man of the enemy's 1st Mixed Regiment of Infantry and Cavalry. Makhno, though, stated that he did not have the wherewithal to follow up the offensive and that it would be feasible to form 2 whole divisions, but the arms and equipment just were not available. He added that the Red Army's 9th Reserve Division, deployed to the north of his brigade, was prone to panic and that its command's sympathies lay with the Whites. He cited the instance of the offensive against Taganrog when this 9th Division fell back abruptly, leading to the encirclement and extermination of a Makhnovist regiment which fought to the bitter end, without surrendering. Then he bemoaned the shortage of armaments. In his report, Antonov comments, his complaint is well-founded, there was neither money nor weapons nor munitions nor equipment. Some time back Dybenko did supply 3,000 Italian rifles with a few cartridges each, and now that the ammunition has run out, these rifles are useless. The remainder of the arms and equipment was booty taken from the enemy. Half of the partisans went barefoot. And what of the charges of banditry? Why, here comes the big bandit. Batko Pravda, the legless cripple commander of a detachment, shows up and salutes Antonov Ovchinko. He is a dyed-in-the-wool libertarian communist and a first-rate fighting man. In spite of this, all sorts of rumors are peddled about him. Allegedly he cuts Bolshevik throats and fights against Soviet power. He has personally slain bandits. Persecution of political commissars? Not a bit of it. But we have need of fighters, not gossips. Nobody drove them out. They buggered off themselves. Of course we do have lots who are opposed to your way of thinking, and, if you wish, we can discuss. Everything that Makhno says is confirmed by the brigade's Bolshevik political commissar. As their conversations proceed, the insurgents and their guests share a meal washed down by some reddish liqueur. Makhno tells Antonov Ovchinko that he is not a drinker and Faith has banned alcohol. The members of the Gulyai Soviet congratulate themselves on their work. The town boasts 3 magnificently appointed secondary schools and some children's communes. 10 military hospitals house 1,000 wounded, but unfortunately there is no experienced doctor. Antonov Ovchinko pays a visit to some of them, finding them to be very clean and spacious, having been set up in seigneurial homes. There is also a repair shop for artillery pieces. Antonov Ovchinko has a tete-a-tete discussion with Makhno about what helped to afford to Soviet Hungary, about the breakthrough in Europe, the danger of an offensive by Denikin, and the need to erect a united, steely front of social revolution against that. In the end, the pair shake hands firmly, looking each other in the eye. Makhno declares that as long as he leads the insurgents, there will be no anti-Soviet acts and that battle without quarter will be waged against the bourgeois generals. Without demur, he agrees to the conversion of his sector of the front into a division, under the command of one Chikhvanaya, with Makhno remaining brigade commander. A great get-together brings the day to a close. Everyone rallies around the watchword of, all out against the common foe, the bourgeois generals. In 1927, in an appendix to this account, quite startling for a Bolshevik at that time, Antonov Ovchinko noted that, in the light of subsequent developments, his testimony might appear to unduly idealize the insurgents, but, he added, he had striven only to be objective. Summarizing his impressions, Antonov Ovchinko telegraphed the following message to Rakovsky on April 29. I spent the entire day with Makhno. He, his brigade and the whole region represent a great fighting force. There is no conspiracy. Makhno himself would not allow it. It is possible to organize the region well, there is excellent material there, and we must keep it on our side and not create yet another new front to fight on. If consistent work is followed through, this region will become an impregnable stronghold. The punitive measures contemplated are senseless. There must be an immediate end of the attacks against the Makhnovists that are beginning to appear in our newspapers. Without waiting for any reply, he also telegraphed to Bubnov and to the editions of the Kharkov Izvestia, the official mouthpiece of the Ukrainian Soviet government. In your edition of April 5, you carried an article entitled Down with the Makhnovskina. That article is awash with mistruths and is blatantly provocative in tone. Such attacks damage our struggle against the counter-revolution. In that struggle, Makhno and his brigade have demonstrated and do demonstrate an extraordinary revolutionary valor, and are deserving, not of abuse from officials, but rather of the fraternal gratitude of all worker and peasant revolutionaries. On May 2, he confirmed his impressions in a more considered report to Lev Kamenev. At the same time, he ordered Skachko, the commander of the Second Army, to waste no time in supplying artillery, for million rubles, equipment, field kitchens, a portable telephone, cartridges for those 3,000 Italian rifles, 2 surgeons, 2 physicians, medical supplies, pharmaceutical equipment and an armored train. All as a matter of urgency. The new front line, fixed by Trotsky along the Donetsk Basin and under the care of the Russian command, which thus stripped Makhno of the supervision of the front which was held by him, Antonov also objected to. Trotsky's reply was typical of him. Your comments, according to which the Ukrainian troops are capable of fighting only under a Ukrainian command, derive from a refusal to look truth in the face. The Makhnovists fall back from the Mariupol front, not because they are under the authority of Hittites and not yours, but because they faced an enemy more daunting than the Patriarists. The main enemy is on the Donetsk Basin, and it is to there that we must switch our main forces. Any delay in this operation would be the most awful crime against the Republic. Antonov reacted with indignation and anger to this chastisement. It would not be hard to discover that, 1. I had undertaken, and continue to do so, every step to convert the insurgent units into regular army. 2. Neither Moscow nor the Commissar for War in Ukraine was of the slightest assistance to me in this organizational endeavor. 3. Nonetheless, some excellent cadres have been formed in Ukraine for the army of the future. The allegation regarding easy victories obtained here is a fantastic concoction by people far removed from the military work in Ukraine. Without bothering to examine all of these arguments properly, you have condemned my whole work in extreme terms. My outrage is great. Obviously, the Carnot of the Russian Revolution, at least as he imagined himself to be, could not countenance anyone's contradicting him in his strategic evaluations. He banked on a push by Denikin in a northerly direction, the target of which would be the Donetsk Basin and a link-up with Kolchak. What followed was to expose the idiocy of Trotsky's calculations. As for Antonov's lobbying, that had scarcely any success, Makhno was outfitted with neither weapons nor equipment, and the hostile press campaign against him carried on in the Bolshevik newspapers. In the wake of his lively retort to Trotsky's sermonizing, Antonov's star seriously declined, and on June 15 he was replaced by Vatsitis, a Let and tsarist ex-colonel, as commander of the Ukrainian front. Intrigued by his impressions, several Soviet bigwigs paid a visit to Guliapoli a week later. Lev Kamenev, aka Rosenfeld, Zionov's brother-in-law, Voroshilov, Meslauk, the Commissar for War in the Ukrainian Soviet government, Muranov, Zorin, Sidersky, and others. Their armored train pulled into Guliapoli station on May 7, 1919, in the morning. They were greeted by Marysia Nikiforova, Mikhailov Pavlenko, and Boris Veritelnikov, who proposed to escort them into town. Half reassured, Kamenev happened to issue instructions to the commander of the train to dispatch a patrol to fetch them, should they fail to return by 6 p.m. Meanwhile, Makhno showed up and was introduced to the new arrivals. He escorted them and along the way pointed out a tree from which he personally had hanged a white kernel. They were welcomed to the town to the sounds of the International and visited the movement's social achievements. They took refreshments and were introduced to a pretty young Ukrainian, Galina Kuzmenko, Nestor Makhno's partner and secretary. Everything went swimmingly, except during an interview with Makhno and his staff, when Kamenev demanded abolition of the Military Revolutionary Soviet, a creation of the Regional Congress. The discussions foundered, for the insurgents explained to him that the aforesaid body had been created by the masses and on no account could it be disbanded by any authority at all. The reply displeased the Red officials. Even so, they bade the Makhnovists fond farewells. Kamenev even embraced Makhno and assured him that the Bolsheviks will always find a common language with authentic revolutionaries like the Makhnovists, and that they could and always should work hand in glove. Upon arrival in Ekaterinodar, Kamenev telegraphed Moscow to have reduced from 1 year to 6 months a conviction against Marysia Nikiforova which banned him from holding office. He also published an open letter to Comrade Makhno, commander of the 3rd Brigade, wherein he stated that the rumors about separatist or anti-Soviet schemes on the part of the Makhnovist insurgents were utterly without foundation. Makhno he described as an upright and dauntless fighter who fought with courage against the whites and foreign invaders. However, he recalled that the front manned by the insurgents was only a 1,000th part of the overall front, and alluded to differences of opinion, which would be smoothed over. If they deliver coal and wheat from the region, the central authorities will then send them the armaments and everything they need. Pyotr Arshinov, who was present at this encounter, later wondered if Kamenev's and even Antonovchenko's attitude had been sincere, or whether they had merely provided cover for a reconnaissance operation in advance of a general Bolshevik offensive against the Makhnovists, an offensive that had been long in the preparation. He based this hypothesis on the conspiracy devised a little later by one Padalka, commander of a regiment of insurgents. Bribed by the Bolsheviks, Padalka was to have seized Makhno and his staff. This scheme was only foiled at the very last minute, thanks to Makhno's unexpected return to Guliapoli from Berdyansk by airplane. This was not impossible, but it strikes us more likely that the initiative had been taken here by some Chekists rather than by political leaders, and the evidence for this is supplied by the telegram that was sent to Kamenev by Lenin on May 7. In that Rostov has not been taken, we need to be temporarily diplomatic with Makhno's army, dispatching Antonov and holding him personally accountable for Makhno's troops. So a double cross was intended, but postponed to a more opportune time. Also, Mahkno was warned by revolutionaries working inside Soviet institutions never to go if summoned either to Ekaterinoslav or to Kharkov, for any official summons would be cover for a trap leading to his death. All of which meant that the Leninists would not on any account tolerate the autonomous activity of the region's insurgent masses and would ultimately use force to curtail it. Some days later, a grave problem confronted the Bolsheviks. Their ally, Grigorev, refused to go fight the Romanians by way of assisting Soviet Hungary and turned against them. This Grigorev had significant muscle at his disposal: 30,000 rifles, 10 armored trains, 700 machine guns, 50 cannon, tanks and trucks. He quickly seized a considerable portion of the western Ukraine. Fearing the worst, i.e., a revolt by the Makhnovists and their throwing in their lot with Grigorev, which would oblige the Bolsheviks to evacuate Ukraine, Lev Kamenev dispatched a telegram to Makhno on May 12, urging him to condemn Grigorev's venture. The traitor Grigorev has delivered the front to the enemy. Refusing to carry out the order to fight, he has turned his guns against us. The moment of decision has come: either you will go with the workers and peasants of the whole of Russia, or you will ipso facto open the front to the enemy. There is no margin for hesitation. Report to me immediately the disposition of your troops and issue a proclamation against Grigorev, sending a copy to me in Kharkov. A failure to reply on your part will be deemed a declaration of war. I believe in the honor of revolutionaries, yours, and that of Arshinov, Veritelnikov and others. Grigorev was a one-time captain of the tsarist army who had been promiscuous in his allegiances. Starting with Kerensky, he moved on to the Ukrainian Roda, the Hetman Skoropadsky, Petlura, and the Directory, and latterly to the Bolsheviks. Each time he had turned savagely against his erstwhile allies and masters, making a decisive contribution to their defeat. On the Bolsheviks' behalf he had fought the French and the Greeks in Odessa. He had captured that great city by routing the Allied troops and giving the French command, which was in the future to fight shy of sending infantry units onto Ukrainian soil and was henceforth to make do with occasionally shelling the revolutionaries from its ships, something to think about. Grigorev was a redoubtable war chief, competent and courageous and always in the thick of the action, which galvanized his men. What is more, he was a sharpshooter. Once he had brought down a marauder with a revolver shot in the head at 50 paces. He was very popular among the poor peasants, who accounted for the bulk of his troops, for he readily issued free the foodstuffs and goods seized from the bourgeoisie. To the great relish of his men, he had a weakness for semi-poetic, semi-Ubu-esque proclamations. In November 1918, he issued a threat to the German generals to the effect that he would swat them like flies, with a flick of his hand, unless they quit Ukraine within 4 days, taking their personal effects with them, otherwise he would send them home in their shirt-tails. He had also threatened to blow out his own brains at the time of the fighting against the Greeks, if his cavalry, surrounded by Greek cavalry mounted on mules and donkeys, and outnumbering him 3-1, managed to beat his men. Happily for him, his horse-riding cavalry had successfully overwhelmed their opponents. Following his entry into Odessa, he had issued Order No. 1 in which he declared that he had trounced the French, the Greeks, the Romanians, and the white volunteers, and thanks to one of his shells might even have toppled Clemențiu from the presidency that he so coveted. A claim that may not be completely devoid of substance. When he turned against the Bolsheviks, he called upon the peasants to fight with whatever they could lay their hands on. If you have no weapons, take up your pitchforks, axes, and stakes and get stuck in. He tried several times to link up with Makhno, but only one of his messages got through to the libertarian. Batko. Why bother with the communists? Knock them on the head. Ataman Grigoriev. His strategy was that of most of the partisan groups. He stuck doggedly to his native soil and refused to go off and fight as a mercenary in Hungary. It was enough for him to hold the Bessarabian front. Let us note at this point that the Bolsheviks had a sizable Hungarian detachment, ex-prisoners from the Austrian army who had not gone home but had been organized as a Red Army unit. They too declined to be assigned to the southern Ukrainian front and wanted to go home and fight. In this regard, the Bolshevik tactic was systematic, and persists to this day. They always used troops who had no links with the region or country in question. Thus into Ukraine they were to dispatch Chinese, Lets, and Germans. The Makhnovists did not know why Grigoriev had become a renegade, so their primary concern was to circulate a general communiqué to affirm their own loyalty to the revolution. Quote, Mariupol campaign headquarters of the Makhnovist army. Copies to all combat sector commanders, all regimental, battalion, company and platoon commanders. Order to be read out to all Makhno troop units, so-called. Copy to Kameen, the extraordinary plenipotentiary of the Defense Soviet. Take most vigorous steps to sustain the front. On no grounds tolerate weakening of the revolution's external front. Revolutionary honor and dignity oblige us to keep faith with the revolution and the people. Grigoriev's squabbles with the Bolsheviks over power cannot induce us to undermine the front which the White Guards mean to smash in order to enslave the people. Until such time as we have vanquished our common enemy in the shape of the Whites from the Don, we will not firmly and fully appreciate the freedom won by our hands and our rifles, and we shall remain on the front, fighting for the people's freedom and not in any circumstances for power, nor for the intrigues of political charlatans. Brigade Commander, Makhno, members of the staff, signatures added. This initial reaction meant that the insurgents were keeping clear of all intrigues and sticking to their battle against the Whites on the front. That one was destined for their fighters. Makhno and his staff at the same time sent this even more explicit reply to Kameen himself. As soon as your telegram was received, I immediately gave the order to hold the front with undiminished firmness, yielding not 1 inch of our positions to Denikin or to any other counter-revolutionary pack, thereby performing our revolutionary duty towards the workers and peasants of Russia and of the whole world. For your benefit, let me declare that the entire front and I will remain unshakably loyal to the worker and peasant revolution, but not to the institutions of violence in the persons of your commissars and Chekists who act arbitrarily against the laboring population. I do not know what he is doing nor what aims he pursues. For that very reason I am going to refrain from publication of a proclamation against him, until such time as I am in receipt of fuller details. As an anarchist revolutionary, let me declare that I cannot by any means support seizure of power by Grigoriev or by anyone, as hitherto, I am going to drive out, with my insurgent comrades, the bands of Denikin, while striving at the same time to let the liberated regions be networked by free unions of peasants and workers who would thus enjoy full powers in their areas. In this respect, agencies of constraint and violence such as Chekers and commissariats, instituting a party dictatorship and exercising their violence even against the anarchist unions and their press, will find us determined adversaries. Brigade Commander, Makhno, members of the staff, signatures appended, Chairman of the Cultural Section, Arshinov. That answer, made in all objectivity and independence of outlook, is dear and unmistakable. The insurgents reaffirmed their loyalty to the revolutionary cause but had no wish to be the deaf, blind puppets of any party, no matter how revolutionary it professed to be. A passing swipe had been made at the Bolsheviks' repressive organs. A word to the wise is enough. Perhaps it was their excesses that had prompted Grigoriev's revolt. In order to shed some light on the matter, a panel of insurgents was set up to go and make an on-site investigation. Meanwhile, the telegram from Grigory, mentioned earlier, arrived. The recommendation to knock the Bolsheviks on the head was a touch vague, and the message went unanswered by the insurgents. Their commission of inquiry made its report. It transpired that Grigory was nothing more than a warlord but one who trailed many poor peasants in his wake. This discovery led the staff and the insurgents' military revolutionary Soviet to draw up a long proclamation headed "Who is Grigory?" exposing the adventurer, his anti-Semitic tendencies when he vented his spleen on those who crucified Christ, and even his anti-Russian mentality when he talked about those who came from the dregs of Moscow. Didn't Grigory gladly crow that whenever he had captured Odessa, with its 630,000 inhabitants, 400,000 of them Jews, a revolutionary committee had immediately been formed, made up of 99 members, 97 Jews, and 2 Russian imbeciles. The Makhnovists also denounced these contradictions when he claimed to be championing the real power of the Soviets, yet simultaneously ordered everybody to elect their commissars and then to mobilize, carrying out his order while he would look after the rest. Yet the Makhnovist proclamation made a distinction between the peasant mass that followed the ataman, a mass to be regarded not so much as counter-revolutionary as the victim of deception, and it was to be hoped that the healthy revolutionary intuition of the peasants would open their eyes and that they will leave Grigory and rally again to the banner of revolution. However, the causes behind his revolt also had to be sought in the Bolsheviks coming to Ukraine and the installation of their party dictatorship, accompanied by its sinister checkers, quote, of which Grigory has made use in his adventure. He is a traitor to the revolution and an enemy of the people, but the party of the Bolshevik communists is every bit as much the workers' enemy. Through its unaccountable dictatorship, it has created among the masses a hatred that currently benefits Grigory and tomorrow may benefit some other adventurer. Let us again remind the laboring people that its deliverance from oppression, poverty, and violence will be secured only by its own efforts. No change of authority will be able to help in that. It is only through their own free organizations of peasants and workers that toilers will arrive at the threshold of social revolution, complete freedom, and authentic equality. End quote. As may be seen, the Bolsheviks too were not spared. Arid had no special grounds for congratulations on this score. The essential point, though, in their eyes was still that Mahkno was not turning against them for the moment. A huge number of copies of this proclamation was run off, and these were distributed among the peasants and fighters. It was also included in the Makhnovist movement's organ, The Road to Freedom, and in the mouthpiece of the Ukrainian Anarchist Confederation, Nabat, Toksin. Grigory became the bête noire of Moscow, who dispatched against him all of the reinforcements meant for the southern front. Worse still, the 1st Red Cossack Regiment, 1,200 horsemen and 8 cannon, and the assault regiment from the Crimea were pulled out of the front lines for use against him. Not everyone accepted the assignment. The Kiev-based 9th Ukrainian Regiment refused at the beginning of May to march against him and was duly disarmed and then reformed. Certain units fraternized with the ataman and defected to his side. He managed to capture Ekaterinoslav but was unable to hold on to it for more than 2 days. On May 20th, by which time Grigory's failure was apparent, Antonov asked Dybenko to transfer his divisions forthwith to the southern front. He met with a refusal, Dybenko claiming that the ataman's revolt was still virulent and that the Red troops had taken heavy losses. This refusal frustrated Antonov, who was keen to marshal Dybenko's divisions plus Pokaz's detachment as urgently as possible on the southern front, in order to amalgamate them with Makhno's brigade before entrusting command of the division thus formed to Chikhvanaya, who was under orders from the party hierarchy. In this way the Batko would have been hemmed in by dependable Bolsheviks and there would have been no further fear of a revolt from that quarter. The politico-strategic consideration of the Red Army's high command were about to confuse the situation to a singular extent and to poison relations with the Makhnovists.